Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, brought to you today by Josh Edison and Dr. M. Dentith. Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. I am Josh Edison here in Auckland, New Zealand, back in lockdown, and not in any lockdown that I'm aware of. It's Dr. M. Dentith in Zhuhai, China.
It's true, I am not locked down, I am living free and easy, with emphasis on free, and probably some emphasis on easy, but not as much emphasis on easy, mostly free.
No, so the shoe is on the other foot, eh? Now
I've
who's
got
the one?
both feet shorn. I'm not quite sure where you're going
Shod.
with shoe
Shorn
on
would be
other
cut
feet.
off, but anyway.
But there's a reason why I'm stuck in this office, Joshua, and it's because of a tragic lacing up my boots accident.
But yes, no, we're back in lockdown here in New Zealand. If you're not from New Zealand and have been paying attention to the news, there was a little bit of it was sort of reported to begin with as New Zealand locks down after only one community case, which is technically true, but it's because we know that where there is one community case, there will be many more already that we don't know about. So the immediate lockdown is to stop the spread. And sure enough, a couple of days later, it's now up to 21, I think.
Yes, and indeed, actually, the reason why lockdown was kind of recommended by the advisors who are, by the nature of their name, advising the government, is that because the first case they found they could not directly link to the border, that did suggest that the virus has been circulating in the population for at least a week for the symptoms to appear and people to report them and to be tested. So the fact there's one case in the community implies, given it's not the border case, that there are probably several cases in the community, and I believe they now have a tentative link to the border, which would date the ingress around about the 9th of August, which is less than 2 weeks ago, which is actually a positive sign in that it's likely to be relatively constrained. Although I say relatively constrained, the case is on the North Shore. The North Shore has an awful lot of schools, and we seem to have cases of the virus being present in school populations. So, containished.
Yes, we have a school, we have a person who's tested positive who a couple of days before had been to church with a couple of hundred people. We've had people being around the city, being in the presence of lots of people. I'm a little bit confused, actually. They've identified a case which, through the whole sort of genomic sequencing thing, appears to be that looks like the person who brought it into the country, someone who came from Australia.
Case.
The index case, indeed. Someone who came from Australia and was in managed isolation where they tested positive. But what's confusing me, though, is that when they're coming up with the places of interest, the places where if you've been there, you need to go and get a test, they're still wanting to look back a week or so further into the past than when this person arrived in the country. So I don't know if they're just being thorough in making sure or what. And of course, the other thing is, although we think we know who the index case is, we still haven't established a link between them and the first person who we found with it in the community. So there's still some chain to be established there. But until we know what's going on, the entire country is in lockdown at the moment. Chances are, since it hasn't been spotted anywhere in the South Island or anywhere outside of Auckland yet, as far as I know, the rest of the country will probably be able to relax in a few days. But it looks like in Auckland, at least, we're into it for another week or two.
Yes, it'll be interesting to see exactly what happens in the next few days. If case numbers start escalating dramatically, as a kind of exponential COVID-19 Delta cases are found, you'll be in lockdown for a while. If it turns out we've dodged another bullet, then who knows? Maybe by this time next week, you'll be broadcasting from a crowded church.
Maybe, yeah.
In the middle of a school.
One of those church. Well, I mean, there are church schools. I say that facetiously, but I probably won't be attending one. But I could. Who knows?
I've always said you should go back to school, Joshua.
Church school. Dun dun.
Yes, it sounds like we're trying to get a spin-off going, and I really don't think this part's going to work out. Joshua has gone back to school in a church.
No, in fact, I don't think this whole preamble is working out anymore now that we've got past the important COVID-related information. So maybe we should just pile straight into the main section of this episode.
Yes, but I'm trying to avoid the main section of the episode because the main section of the episode is depressing.
Well, it's a bit depressing, but so's a lot of the stuff we talk about sometimes.
Yes, I suppose that's true. I'll play a sting.
Yes, now we mentioned this last week, I'm pretty sure, what we were going to talk about this time, because just over a week ago now, I think, there were an interesting set of articles in the local news. I'm trying to look up the date of the story, and it's not showing me the bloody date.
I
When
believe
was
it's
it? Damn you!
2
There we go.
weeks
9th.
ago.
2 weeks ago, 9th of
So
August.
yes,
This
the
one
9th of
first showed.
August, when COVID-19
Ooh.
likely entered the country, and there was a story about white supremacists as a cover story. I think this deserves.
If it doesn't, I don't know what does.
Well, precisely.
But yes, there are a couple of articles in Critic, which is the University of Otago student magazine, where they said that someone from there had spent 6 months working undercover with the group Action Zealandia. Now, we've talked about Action Zealandia before, haven't we?
Indeed, we had an entire episode devoted to an interview with Byron Clark talking about Action Zealandia and their podcast, where they've been presenting the views of people like Kerry Bolton, the country's most notable white supremacist, far-right intellectual.
Mm. And so, yes, this person basically has reported back and talked about a lot of unsettling things that this white supremacist group has been getting up to.
Now, what's notable about this story is that in many respects, what the 3 articles in Critic, the University of Otago student magazine, actually attest to are technically things we already knew. So there isn't much in the way of new information. But what's interesting about these stories is that, of course, Action Zealandia denies the truth of what we already know and claims that they are just a benign social club for white guys who are proud of their ancestry and their citizenship, who simply want to go about engaging in sporty like activities and certainly don't have any specifically racist views and certainly aren't going around drawing links to other fascist organizations around the world. So, what we're going to talk about here are things that we have actually mentioned in the past, but are things which are denied by the organization that we're looking at. So, what's really important about what Critic has done here is that by sending someone in for 6 months to gather information, we have first hand evidence that Action Zealandia has been lying profusely about their activities and their goals, even if it turns out we never believed those lies. We now have evidence to show that the lying liars are lying liars.
Yes, so this person spent 6 months pretending to be a white supremacist, which, as you can imagine, probably wasn't a lot of fun.
Indeed, I think they even mentioned that in one of the articles that spending 6 months pretending to be a white supremacist is not a great time.
No, they found it very stressful. They thought, to the extent that a couple of times they thought they had blown their cover because they because they couldn't keep up the requisite amount of hatefulness. It's
Actually, so this reminds me of a story from my youth, back when I was planning to be a Catholic priest and went over to Pymble in Sydney, Australia, to inquire into joining the Jesuits. And talking with the novice master there, the novice master said, "Look, I have a particular way to tell whether a novice is suitable for entering the priesthood or whether we should send them back into the community so they can be a secular helper to the Roman Catholic Church." He said, "The method is simply this. I will surprise them at some point in the day and say, 'Are you meant to be here?' And if it takes them more than a second to respond, that's it, they're out of the order." And I imagine that there's something very similar when it comes to being policed by the senior membership of Action Zealandia, and that if they get just ever so slightly suspicious of you, they will put you on the spot and expect immediate responses. Because if you even slightly hesitate, in espousing, say, white supremacist or white nationalist views, then the members of Action Zealandia are probably going to go, I don't think this person's heart is in it. And given they're a paranoid organization in the first place, they're probably then going to think, I think this person might be a plant. So, yeah, spending 6 months being on your toes about this stuff cannot be pleasant.
Mm. Um, yeah, so one of the things, as you say, with the paranoia, is that all of the members of Action Zealandia use pseudonyms, even amongst themselves. So, although we know the identities of some of the key figures, most of the people don't actually know who each other are, which obviously helps if you're going in undercover. Um, I was a little bit confused. They made it sound like it's sometimes the actual reporter who went undercover suggests their identity is still being kept secret, obviously to avoid harassment. There's an article in the Herald which talked to the features editor at Critic and kind of made it sound like they were the one and identified them by name, but I don't. Which seemed odd to me, since elsewhere they were trying to keep it. So I'm not sure if it was just a misunderstanding, and the editor was speaking for the reporter. But either way, we won't use their name here, just in case.
Yes, I mean,
Um,
I was also confused by this as well, because it is true that the critic pieces are guest editorials as published by the editor of the guest editorial sections of Critic. And I think that maybe the Herald got a little bit confused there between someone being the editor of a section and someone being a guest editor and thinking 1 + 1 = 2, where in this case 1 + 1 equals God knows.
mm. But anyway, so as to the article itself, this individual, this unknown individual reporter, um, met with 6 different members of Action Zealandia. Apparently, had voice calls with 2 of their leaders and was in their online chats for most of this year. This person, I say person, Action Zealandia apparently does not admit women. It's a male only organization. Um, so he was involved in message boards, and again with the sort of the paranoia, the messaging was tightly controlled to make sure that not, what goes on tour stays on tour. Nothing leaves the chat room itself. Um, and in particular, the sort of I gather the sort of the jokiness was discouraged, because they know that can we've all seen examples of people getting in trouble for saying the wrong thing in the wrong place.
Yeah, so there's one
Um,
example in one of the editorials about the way in which one of the members of Action Zealandia, talking about kind of racial purity and the like, made a joke about we should only have sex with our siblings. And then one of the senior members of Action Zealandia went, look, don't delete all of these messages. We do not want any message of this type getting out, because we know how this is going to be presented, even though we know it was presented as a joke in the first instance. So they are very, very, very strict on controlling their messaging, because they don't want anything bad to get out about their organization, even if it turns out it's jocular.
mm. And yes, the cynic in me thinks they know full well that people would take anything like that they can find out of context to make them look bad, because it's exactly what they would do to other people. Um, but in terms of what this person found out about Action Zealandia and the membership of itself, I mean, Action Zealandia apparently is a relatively small group, only about 30 people nationwide. But of course, it doesn't actually take a large group of people to do a large amount of damage.
Yes,
Um,
indeed, as we saw back with the terrorist incident down in Otatahe, it only requires one terrorist to shoot up 2 mosques and kill 53 people.
so it doesn't, yeah, the small numbers aren't necessarily reason to write them off as no threat.
Yes, indeed.
Uh,
Actually, this is something which has been a big discussion with respect to lone wolf terrorism in the US in particular, which is it really isn't the number of terrorists you need to be concerned with in this particular respect. It's how likely are they to act upon their ideologies. And the worry is that given what happened at Otatahi and the mosque shootings, we know that there are people out there with beliefs of this type who are willing to, in quotes, go to battle over their belief systems.
Mm. Another fact about the membership, apparently they're mostly aged between 18 and 35. I'm not quite sure how did they get that if people's identities remained anonymous? Was
So
there a bit of
one of the
detective work?
members is 42 and is a remaining member of the prior movement, the Dominion movement. So I think they've basically indexed from, look, we've got one person and we know their age, 42, and we're taking that to be the kind of upper bound of membership age. And we've got a few examples of people whose ages we also know from messages we've got from our 6 months of infiltration. And that allows us to get a medium, a mode, a mean, an average, and any other quantitative statistical analysis you want to do.
Mm. So it seems to be mostly younger men. Um, that Kerry Bolton fellow, I've seen his videos. He didn't. He's no spring chicken
But he's not a member of Action Zealandia.
as
He's kind of
such.
an
No.
associate of
Mm.
Action Zealandia. So Kerry, if you listen to the podcasts that he's done with the Action Zealandia senior membership, admires Action Zealandia, and thinks if he was younger he would join, but he does take it to be a youth movement, and he
Mm.
is not a youth.
But yes, the Dominion movement is interesting because immediately following the shootings in Otatahi, Christchurch, obviously the outpouring of grief and outrage, the white nationalists were smart enough to know that, okay, now's not the time to be a visible white nationalist, and the Dominion movement itself basically collapsed almost immediately. Um, but as we've sort of seen, and as this article shows, they didn't actually go away, did they? They just kind of went underground and into places like Action Zealandia, who try to keep most of what they're doing off the radar,
Yes, I believe the
under the radar.
leadership of the Dominion movement basically has evaporated and disappeared, and Action Zealandia kind of filled in that void. But I also think they probably took a lot of the membership of the Dominion movement into their organization as they were founded. So, I mean, it does seem there's pointed criticism by Action Zealandia around the way the Dominion movement was run and the fact it collapsed so quickly after the mosque shootings. There's a kind of impression you get from the way that Action Zealandia talk about things that if the Dominion movement had had a spine, to use terrible toxic language here, they could have weathered that storm and they would have been fine, but instead they collapsed under public pressure. So I think the leadership went away and Action Zealandia was then formed, and those people who were sympathetic or members of the Dominion movement probably then kind of glommed onto this new organization.
Mm. So the actual process of becoming now, one thing I wasn't quite clear on: did this person actually become an actual vetted member of Action Zealandia, or did they just hang out in the chat rooms with Action Zealandia members?
I'm assuming that if they got into the chat room, they became a vetted member. I mean, because I
Right.
mean they went on hikes with these people. They were on the
Mm.
message boards with these people. They met some of these people in person. Action Zealandia, given the secrecy that goes around everything they do, probably doesn't just have random associates turn up. You would have to be a vetted member to find out about the
Mm.
activities. So, yes, I'm assuming they were, to use terrible gang terminology, a fully blooded member of Action Zealandia.
Mm. Well, and certainly they know plenty about the vetting process. So presumably, because they went through it themselves, you need to have a voice call with a senior member to be vetted. You're asked about your political beliefs, drug and alcohol use, and fitness. This is one of those groups, obviously, that's all about has a lot of um, that sort of very very quote unquote manly thing about being fit and healthy and good examples of their race. Um, they After they've been vetted over the telephone or internet call, I suppose it is 2021. They do need to meet a person in person, or come along to a group event in order to be fully vetted. Interesting that they're worried about. They don't want to consist entirely of outcasts, of society's outcasts. I don't know. Is that just an image thing? They don't want the media to be say, "Oh, look, these are just randos who've glommed onto this toxic ideology because their lives are so crap," or is it more part of the whole supremacist part of white supremacists? They want to feel like they're the cream of society.
Yes, I do think what they want are the Ubermensch to be able to join the organization. And it seems that at the moment they're only attracting cucks. No
Uh,
chads, only cucks.
uh, that's a shame, by which I mean it isn't.
No, not at all.
Mm.
Let us be clear. We do not want good people joining bad organizations. I'm about to say we don't want chads joining bad organizations. I don't think we actually should have any discussion about whether we think chads are good or bad. Well, I suspect actually I think we think chads are bad. I think this kind of stereotyping
I think the
of masculinity
terminology is
yeah.
kind of bullshit.
Yeah, in fact,
But
actually,
yes,
I'm regretting using all
yeah.
of these words right now.
Let's just back up, back
Yeah,
right up. Um,
I've
yeah.
been
So
cut
that's
by my own words.
you have. So that's the membership and the process of becoming a member. But as to what they're actually up to, so I mean, one of the things they said is that they have been fairly active in trying to form links with white nationalist groups overseas. Which I mean, I know we've seen the terrorist shooter from Christchurch gets letters from all over the world, or has people attempting to send letters to him from all over the world, and was receiving them for a while, I think, until somebody put a stop to that. So yes, there is this worldwide network out there which they would very much like to be a part of.
Yes, in fact, actually, as we'll talk about in a moment, they've had a bit of a problem with their trying to hook up with fascist groups in Australia. But yes, they are part of a movement to try and get a kind of global fascist youth movement going on worldwide. And indeed, actually looking at their website, because occasionally I do pop over to the Action Zealandia website to find out what awful things they're saying now. They had an entire post about how they had joined in with the Boer Lives Matter Day of Protest a month or so ago, which, to my great dismay, had a picture of white supremacists in Romania standing in front of a Romanian monument with a Boer Lives Matter flag. And I was going, no, no, not Romania. Please, not Romania. And I don't even know why I'm surprised by this, because one time where I was out buying jewelry, because people may be aware, I like to wear a lot of rings. I'm not wearing any at the moment because I find that I click and clack them whilst I'm recording, so it's not a good idea to wear jewelry whilst recording a podcast. And I went into this silverware store and I was looking through all the rings they had, and I noticed an Iron Cross ring, which is the symbol of the fascist organization in many Eastern European societies. And then I looked around the rest of the store and went, that's a fascist symbol. That's a fascist symbol. That's a fascist I think I'm in a fascist silverware store. And so I backed out of the store very, very slowly. So, yes, they are engaging in trying to get into this kind of global fascist movement. And indeed, now this is personal information, this wasn't information that was in the article itself, but I have been told that Action Zealandia, to a large extent, has given up on trying to turn the country fascist and really want to get on the gravy train of becoming fascist commentators overseas in the hope that they can get funding from the kind of the global fascists, the people who are funding organizations in Western and Eastern Europe. So much of their outreach isn't just about getting other fascists to talk with them. It's all about finding out how can we become one of those fascists who gets flown around the place to talk at rallies about fascism back home. So there's a
Who,
certain kind of outreach going on there for financial gain.
who's the local? Who's a bit of a darling of the conservative right in the States?
Oh, Trevor Loudon.
Trevor Loudon, yeah, yeah.
I mean, he's a
Well,
libertarian rather than a
mm,
fascist. But yes,
yeah,
he is very much, not only
a
is he a
fascist
darling
analog of him. Mm,
Not only is he a darling in the US, a friend of the show, Marty Orr, got in contact with me the other day to say that Trevor Loudon was in Boise, Idaho, giving talks to the local Republicans there. And Marty was demanding a kind of swap. If Trevor Loudon is allowed to go to Boise, Idaho to give talks, then Marty Orr should be allowed to come to New Zealand to take refuge from what's going on in the US. And frankly, I think that
Sounds
would
fair to
benefit
me.
both. Yeah, it would
Yeah,
benefit both nations.
definitely. Um, but back to Action Zealandia. So that's that's their larger aims in terms of their beliefs. So obviously, white supremacism. There's a lot of your great replacement theory and all of that business. Apparently, they're anti-vaxxers as well.
They are. They take it that vaccines are a way of depopulating the Earth's population. On the podcast, and we'll talk about the podcast towards the end of this discussion, they've intimated this is part of a Jewish plot to depopulate the world. So they are recommending that their members do not get the COVID-19 vaccine.
Right. I'm actually okay with that. I think, but it's yeah, no, it seems an interesting mesh between the whole sort of fit and healthiness and not wanting to have anything to do with vaccines. Although I suppose you could say they're of the sort that believes their natural immunity due to their healthy, drug-free lifestyles will see off
And
that
also
nasty
their
COVID.
Christian faith, Joshua. I mean, there's an
Ah, yes.
entire Christian set of belief systems about you don't need a vaccine, God will protect you, which, as someone pointed out on Twitter the other day, the Old Testament is filled of examples of God sending plagues to wipe
Mm.
out people he doesn't like.
I've heard that a bunch, and there's that old story. I've seen I've seen it sort of quoted in popular culture, but it's been around for ages. Of the person in a flood. There's the Christian sort of parable of a person. There's a flood coming, and when it's announced, somebody drives past in their car and says, hey, come with me, I'll get you out of here before the flood comes. And the guy says, no, no, my faith in God will save me. And then the flood waters start rising, and the person's forced to shelter inside their house. And someone rows past in a boat in the flooded waters and says, hey, quick, hop in my boat. Um, I'll save you from the floodwaters. And he says, no, thank you, but my faith in God will save me. And then the waters rise even higher, and he's forced to sit on the roof of his house because they're that high. And a rescue team comes by in a helicopter and says, hop in, we'll save you, don't worry. And he said, no, thank you, but fine, I'm fine. I have faith that God will save me. And then the flood waters rise even higher. He's swept away and drowns and winds up in heaven. And when he gets to heaven, he says, God, look, I don't understand. I had faith in you this whole time. Why didn't you save me? And God says, what do you mean save you? I sent you a car, I sent you a boat, and I sent you a helicopter. And as soon as I hear people saying, "Honor your God, God will keep me safe," I'm like, yes, He will, by giving you a bloody vaccine, by inventing, I'm quite certain that a good number of the people inventing these sorts of things are people of faith anyway. And yes, I just automatically go to that and think, you people are foolish.
And indeed, actually, in a lot of mainstream Christianity, the typical interpretation of the parable of the loaves and the fishes, where Jesus seems to miraculously produce bread and fish to feed the populace, is not taken to be a miracle in the sense that Jesus made food out of whole cloth. It's the idea that there was a massive sharing event going on that wasn't common for feasts of that particular time. And people shared their food, and it turned out there was more than enough food to feed the crowd. So there's there's an entire aspect of mainstream Christianity that goes, look, miracles don't need to be miraculous in the sense of supernatural intervention. Sometimes by this kind of God's intervention on the world, we're talking about people reaching out to help one another in a kind of Christian charity. And now I'm beginning to feel as the podcast is taking a decidedly
It's
religious
suddenly
turn from two
become the
people who
podcaster's
are,
guide to Jesus.
from two people who are devout atheists.
We certainly are, but yes, it still bugs me when I see people using their faith wrong, quite frankly.
Well, precisely.
Anyway, we're possibly getting on this tangent because who wants to talk about the bloody fascists at Action Zealandia? But we started, so we'll finish. Um, Now we do know, although they use pseudonyms even when talking to each other, that their leader is this fellow called James Fairburn, and he's a guy who's made the news here not too long ago because he was a member of the New Zealand Armed Forces.
Or at least the Army Reserves, I believe.
Was it? I don't know. He certainly had army connections, which was a bit of a worry. But yes, he left the Army Reserves late last year after these links of his to Action Zealandia were made public. And he doesn't seem like the nicest fellow. A couple of arrests under his belt.
One
Um,
for vandalism, one for breaching his parole conditions after being convicted for vandalism. He was also stopped at the border because he was going over to Australia to spend time with Thomas Sewell, who's a member of the Australian National Socialist Network. National Socialist. Now, where have I
ooh,
heard
sounds
that name
familiar. Really
before?
does. Yeah,
Yeah. Now,
it'll come
apparently,
back.
Fairburn was ousted as leader back in either April or May. The dates seem a little bit iffy here. After he was arrested for breaching his bail conditions. And another senior member of Action Zealandia took over temporarily. This person has the pseudonym of Fred. Now, under Fred's leadership, the group actually went from political actions to largely what it claims to be, which is a community building, exercise orientated group for young white men who love their country. But at some point, about a month or so later, Fairburn returned, and the group has once again returned back to political activism. And this is apparently the source of some discontent in Action Zealandia, and that some members would rather be a health focused group than a politically active one.
Hmm. When we say political activism or political actions, I've read a fair bit about putting up of posters and things like that, making their views visible. I see one of their members is up on espionage charges, although is that related to white supremacism, or is that just what the guy gets up to in his private time?
This is an open question, and that this stuff has been tried, I believe, under a military tribunal. Although, I think they were at one stage arguing it could go into the criminal courts. It's a bit hard to talk about because there's a whole bunch of sub judice things going on here. But it does appear to be at least somewhat tangentially related to the Action Zealandia work.
Hmm. But carrying on with the political bit, what they would really like is to actually infiltrate New Zealand's political parties so that they could presumably actually start getting their views more widely heard, I suppose. And I mean, I guess the dream would be to actually put their views into practice via Parliament, but that certainly would be a long way off. And as you say, possibly they acknowledge actually out of the realms of possibility in New Zealand. But
Yes, when you only have 30 members, it's going to be very hard to take over a political party. But they've looked at two parties in particular. They've looked at the New Zealand National Party, which is our standard centre right party, currently led by Judith Collins, which they've identified as being somewhat weak and thus pliable in our current political situation, which seems like a fair assessment. National is
hmm,
not doing particularly well, and they're not doing particularly well with a leader, Judith Collins, who seems to be quite happy to engage in racist rhetoric around the country of Aotearoa, New Zealand, at the moment. So I think they've identified that there is at least a possibility of doing something to get National on board. The problem is National is very big. National has a very set hierarchy in its party structure, and it's also very much controlled by the rich donors who control the kind of the board and the executive board that runs National. So 30 cucks without much money are probably not going to be in a situation to be able to rejuvenate National into a National Socialist Party. So the
hmm,
other party they're looking at is good old Social Credit. Now, Social Credit used to be the third biggest party in the country, and no longer is, but still does technically exist.
Yeah, I mean, it's a name that I've heard, but I don't really know much more than that about them. They're not a particularly large presence. Apparently, though, they were started by a fellow called Clifford Douglas in the early 20th century, and he argued that. The name social credit comes from the fact that he argued that big banks needed to be broken up and that international Jewry were behind those big banks. So obviously, there was no shortage of anti-Semitism in the early Social Credit Party. Apparently, the group reformed in the 1970s and booted out the anti-Semitic members. Although whether all trace of them has gone is up to question, I understand.
Yeah, so social credit still does exist. When I was in Kirikiriroa last year for the 2020 election, I could have cast a vote for social credit. They were running a candidate in my electorate. And it is the case if you spend some time looking at local and general election candidates, you'll find the occasional social credit member has managed to persist in some region for quite some time. And when you start reading their manifestos, they are certainly very weird. So the whole social credit economic system is contra orthodox economics at this particular moment. Well, there's probably an entire episode to be made on social credit, their conspiracy theories, and how they kind of recast themselves afterwards. We should probably put that on the list of future
Hmm.
episodes to do. But it isn't clear that even though they ejected their anti Semitic members in the 70s, that some of those members haven't kind of crawled back. Because in the 70s, social credit was a large party. So when they did their ejection of the anti Semitic members of the party base, they will kind of rejuvenate themselves and look like a sensible alternative to National or Labour. But eventually that kind of collapsed, and social credit has completely disappeared from the electoral landscape to the point where you don't know anything about it. And it's possible that in that time, those anti Semitic members who were ejected have managed to kind of crawl back or be the only members left willing to take on the social credit name.
Hmm. But yeah, it doesn't look like they're going to have much luck in any case there, um, which is kind of the end of the information on their aims and goals and what have you. Apart from the whole idea of their goal of presenting themselves as a benign, perfectly respectable organization, as we've said, they want to be seen as just a group of people who happen to be white and are proud of the fact that they're white and don't take it any further than that, and like doing a bunch of men doing manly things in the outdoors, having a hike, getting a bit of fresh air, um, and happening to have a vaguely common ethnic heritage. But try as they might, though, that's not really what they are, and it does eventually start coming out in the things they say and do.
Yes, so they're quite good at staying on message when it comes to their website. So when you've got copy, you can sit down, you can edit the racism out of copy, or at least make the racism very cryptic. But they've got a podcast, and they're not very good at staying on message when it comes to recording the podcast. There's a kind of glee in their voice when they talk about certain subjects. They make jokes about Jewish conspiracies on the podcast in a way which is meant to come across as being good natured, but really doesn't sound like anything other than, oh, we're joking about this thing we really do believe. So, yes, they're trying desperately hard to stay on message and present the idea that they are just a benign political organization of young men who like being fit and healthy and love their country. And then their podcast exists as a document that goes, yeah, there's a lot more going on here. And of course, we have the situation where someone spent 6 months infiltrating their ranks to get a clear indication of what they say behind the scenes.
Hmm. And maybe that's a good thing to talk about finally, the whole infiltration thing, because we've looked at the Sunstein and Vermeulen paper where they basically recommended the infiltration of conspiracist networks, and then old Curtis Hagen was having nothing of that, and as I recall, Lee Basham wasn't too fond of it either. Although it doesn't. I suppose first of all, there are two bits of infiltration there. There's Action Zealandia wanting to infiltrate the likes of political parties, but then of course there's the critic reporter who successfully infiltrated them. I noticed though that the at least in the goal of the critic reporter, in the case of the critic reporter, their goal wasn't to spread disinformation and try to sort of damage the group from within. They were simply um, finding out information and then getting out and reporting that to the rest of us. So I don't think the likes of your Curtis Hagens and your Lee Bashams would have a problem with what they did, would they?
I wouldn't think so, in part because the worry about the Sunstein and Vermeulen hypothesis is the idea it would be the state engaging in this infiltration, and the state basically infiltrating groups that are saying bad things about the state doesn't want people to believe, which automatically sounds ever so slightly suspicious. The critic, not the sitcom, the critic. Although, God, if only they were making more of that. Critic is not, as far as I'm aware, an organ of the New Zealand government. As far as I'm aware, it is a student magazine for the University of Otago, probably run on a pittance, and they were simply doing some investigative reporting of an organization that was not going to be interviewed, or at least not interviewed in a way where they would give truthful and sincere answers to a reporter's questions. So if someone infiltrates the group, they do their reporting, and then they get out. So that's not the kind of cognitive infiltration that Sunstein and Vermeulen were talking about. Although it is still interesting that it shows that there are certain kinds of infiltration that we take to be not problematic, or at least not entirely problematic, versus the idea that if the government was engaging in activities of this kind, which presumably the Secret Service might be doing, then we start to become a little bit suspicious about their motivations. Indeed, we know that the Secret Service in Aotearoa, New Zealand, has engaged in infiltration of left wing activist groups. And we take that to be a very, very suspicious thing to do, especially when dealing with environmentalist groups that are protesting against polluting industry. So, yes, there's a worry that when the state does it, there's something weird going on there about the power relationship. When it's a student rag engaging in doing this kind of thing, that power relationship is nowhere near as clear. And indeed, we can probably give a story about how this is a fairly benign, or at least standard investigative tool when you're trying to investigate whether people are doing bad things behind the scenes.
Hmm. Um, but it is all still very interesting to a podcast. It's about conspiracy theories. We have an organization which itself is fairly conspiratorial. They're very definitely acting in secret in many cases, but taking great pains to keep their activities and their opinions secret. Um, they also promote various conspiracy theories, your anti-Jewish stuff, your Great Replacement stuff. But we also have, of course, Critic Magazine operating a conspiracy against their conspiracies. It's conspiracies all the way down.
It's true. It's just one conspiracy after the other. Indeed, are we part of a conspiracy, Joshua? Are we?
Almost certainly.
Yes, well, actually, we probably are, because given that we did that episode on Action Zealandia's podcast, and we talked with people who were investigating Action Zealandia, who are keeping themselves anonymous, and thus we're using Byron Clark as a mouthpiece, and that sounds if I'm
Sounds a little
downplaying Byron's
pornographic,
role
but
there.
anyway.
Byron was doing good work there, but he was also kind of speaking on behalf of another organization. Then we're quite definitely part of a conspiracy conspiring against people who are conspiring, who are probably being conspired against by other groups as well. So basically, there's a
Hmm.
whole bunch of overlapping conspiracies here, of which we are a part of at least one of them.
Hmm.
Or are we?
Or are we?
Are we?
Or are we?
Are we? See,
Yes,
now it just sounds like a sound. Are
it
we?
does a little.
Are we?
Yes. Now we did have some other information about Nazis in New Zealand, but we're pretty much reaching the time when an episode would normally wrap up, and I think we've kind of talked enough about Nazis in New Zealand so far. Maybe we can save this for next week or another time or a bonus episode.
Precisely. I had a worry that maybe talking about the pieces from Critic may not take up the full hour, so I had a little bit of additional information about a Nazi in our midst, not literally Josh and my own midst, but the midst of the country of Aotearoa, New Zealand. But I think we can probably do the story when we take a look at the Willie Hoover story generally, because we have kind of danced around the SS officer who died in the South Island thing by talking about it. We should probably do a special episode on that. So we've actually got 2 episodes to do now. We've got social credit, and we've got Nazi war criminals who die not answering for their crimes in our home country to look at. So much more work to do.
Hmm. But that's all for now. So after this, of course, if you're a patron, you'll get to listen to the bonus episode that we're about to record, where we'll be looking at what Vinnie Eastwood and Billy TK got up to the last couple of days. If you're a fan of Schadenfreude, I think this might be the episode for you.
I thought their work in the 80s was great, but the 90s albums they released were
early
terrible.
Schadenfreude. You can't go past it.
Yeah, precisely.
We're going to look at Scottish people stealing Edinburgh Castle, or trying to. Well, of course, we have to follow up what that pillow guy in America's been up to, because last week I think it was just before he was about to bring down the entire government and see Trump installed. So let's check in and see whether or not that actually happened. And then a little bit of Russians and chimpanzees.
Precisely. Chimpanzee to chimpanzee. Oh, you'll never make a monkey out of me.
That's entirely true. Now, I would normally I would be quite happy to sit back and let you go through the entire Stop the Planet of the Apes I want to get off, but I think we're right about at the end, so maybe we should end this episode. Maybe you can start the next episode. You can start the bonus episode with that. I don't know. I don't know if that's a threat or a promise to our people who might want to become patrons specifically to hear that episode. And if you do want to become a patron, go to patreon.com and search for the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. And if you're already a patron, well, you don't have a choice. The episode's there and you have to listen to it. That's
yes,
the
you
law.
are legally obliged.
But at any rate, let's bring this one to a close before we jump onto our Russian monkeys. And that simply leaves me to say goodbye to you, Russian monkeys, and everyone else.
And for me to say, valet, Sean Locke, valet.
Oh, right, Sean Locke. Yeah, that was a shame.
Yeah.
You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Addison and Dr. MRX Denton, which is written, researched, recorded and produced by Josh and M. You can support the podcast by becoming a patron via its Podbean or Patreon campaigns. And if you need to get in contact with either Josh or M, you can email them at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com or check their Twitter accounts, Monkey Fluids and Conspiracism. And remember, it's just a step to the left.